Hi, I'm Len Epp from Leanpub, and in this episode of the Front Matter podcast, I'll be interviewing Rich Rogers. Rich is a software and technology testing and quality consultant based in Sydney, and the author of Changing Times, Quality for Humans in a Digital Age, which he recently published on Leanpub. His book considers the relationship between people and technology, and not exactly in the genre typical of books that address this topic. The genre publishers refer to as prescriptive nonfiction that makes up the majority of technical books published on Leanpub. Rather, the book is structured around, while it does have a lot of prescriptive nonfiction and excellent information in it and advice. The book is structured around the fictional story of a journalist named Kim and her relationship with a technology that has an impact on her life. In this interview, we're going to talk about Rich's professional interests, his book, and at the end we'll talk about his experience a little bit as a self-published writer and author. So thank you, Rich, for being on the Front Matter podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
As I think you know, I usually like to start these interviews by asking people for their origin story. I gathered from the preface to your book that your interest in software and technology generally goes back to your early childhood, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you first got interested in computers and technology.
Yeah, sure. I mean, as I mentioned in the book, as a child growing up in the UK in the 1980s, I became interested in technology really from the point of view of how it can help people. And I mentioned examples like calculators and VCRs and home computers. They were the kind of things that really sort of caught my interest. And I guess what maybe makes me slightly different to some in the field is that my interest was in how those things could help people rather than how they worked. I wasn't someone who kind of took calculators apart to see, the internal workings. I was more interested in the ways they could help people. And I guess that's kind of followed through in my career. I've worked in software development for over 20 years, most of that time as a tester or involved in testing to some extent. But I've really been kind of interested in the way technology helps people, and I think that's a really important thing for testers to keep in mind. But it's really something that's kind of played out through my career, and I guess as I wrote the book, I really wanted to focus on that aspect of technology, how it could help people, and also how people were involved in creating technology and what it meant to the people involved in software development and the broader sort of technology world.
And did you study computer science in university?
Yeah, so I mean, I did some computer science at school, and I also had a home computer, and we did some programming and coding at home, very very basic coding. I actually had an Acorn Electron, which was a bit of an obscure computer. Most kids had Spectrums or Commodore 64s. We had an Acorn Electron which used BBC Basic, and we learned, myself and my brother learned how to write some simple code on there. Mostly we just played games, but we did do some coding. And then through school, computer science, I learned a bit more, and then took that on into university. But the course I actually did at university was called a business and technology course. So it wasn't purely a course to learn about computer science. It was very focused on the applications of technology and the applications of computers in the business world. So again, it had that kind of balance between the technical side and the real world application.
I actually have a specific question about business and technology that I'm going to ask you in a couple minutes. But I wanted to, before jumping ahead, I wanted to ask how you got into testing.
Yeah, I mean, I was very fortunate when I left university in that I had a friend whose mother was a director of a software house, a software development company. And I had a chat with her, and they were keen to bring in some graduates, and I took a job with them. And I think at that time they were needing to increase their kind of testing capability. They had lots of people coming in doing development work, but they were needed to grow their testing team. I hadn't particularly selected testing as a discipline that I wanted to be involved in. But it was a good place for me to start my career. And I really enjoyed it. And, it just became something where I really felt that I could get a good all-round understanding of the products that I tested and how they were used. And over time, I started to, just really develop that interest in testing and the different ways that testing was performed. And of course, working in different industries and for different companies, there were very different approaches to testing. Some very, very large-scale operations, some very procedural testing operations, some which were more exploratory. And actually, certainly in the early stages of my career, I think that there was less procedure and more exploration involved in testing. But it became a real passion of mine, and I guess associated with that, I got to see the quality of software that was actually delivered, and I got to see some of the decisions that went into whether quality was fit to be shipped, and that was a really interesting thing as well. I don't necessarily believe that it's a tester's role to make those decisions, but you certainly get an indication of how those decisions are made as a tester.
I know this next question has many answers to it, but if maybe you could start with an example of your first testing job. What does a tester of your category do? I mean, most people are probably familiar with the idea of, say, a video game tester who, let's say it's a racing game, they tell you to floor it and pull to the right and just hit the edge of the track for an hour straight and see what happens. Yeah. Try to break things that you're interacting with game style. What would for example, like when you were first getting started out, when there weren't necessarily so many processes or things like that, how did you go about testing, and what kinds of things were you testing?
Yeah, I mean, the first company I worked for, it was actually a company called Paradigm, and they created software for manufacturing organisations. So it controlled some of the machinery in factories, and it also was involved in logistics and delivery planning and that kind of side of things. And you used a very interesting phrase when you asked that question there about seeing how things work, and I think that's sometimes something that is lost in testing. So good testers do tend to approach things and look at things from a point of view of learning about them and understanding how they work. What has tended to happen with testing is that it's become far more sort of rigid and specification or requirement based. So confirming that requirements have been met rather than thinking about how does this thing actually work. So my philosophy, certainly in the early days, was very much around getting an understanding of whatever it was I was testing, and learning about it and providing information on it. I think I probably lost that for part of my career because I think many testers will say the same thing. They kind of got pulled into this world of doing things on a very sort of regimented and procedural way. So for me, I mean, testing is about providing information to people and doing that through learning and exploring whatever it is that you're testing.
Circling back to what I mentioned before about, I had a question related to business and sort of IT. One thing that I saw from your LinkedIn profile that when I was researching for this interview, I saw that you worked on the integration program for the Lloyd's TSB and HBOS merger back in the day. And I'm in a former life, I was an investment banker in London, and I sort of left just before this infamous merger happened. I suppose I could say infamous. A little bit of background for people listening. Around the time the credit crunch was turning into the Great Recession and, investment banks were collapsing, the Bank of Scotland ran into a bit of trouble and was acquired by Lloyd's TSB, this big bank, and it was very controversial at the time for a number of reasons. But one of the reasons I bring it up is kind of selfish because, having worked in M&A from the investment banking side, the details on the ground of what an acquisition or a merger looks like were something that I actually never really, I never sort of put on the hard hat, as it were. And this was a very important merger. And I think, we often hear about things like, Amazon just bought Whole Foods and stuff like that. But what was that like, working on a team trying to bring together these two banks? I mean, where, people's life savings and, the economy, the wider economy is at stake. What kind of work did you do, and what was the temperature like?
Yeah. Look, it was a unique program of work. I mean, it was absolutely enormous, that program, and my involvement on it was really tiny in the grand scheme of things, because it was such a huge program and it affected so many people. But it was a perfect example of how testing can become very, very regimented. There was a big organisation who were controlling the testing activity that went on across that whole organisation, and really it became a case of a lot of reporting, a lot of providing metrics, a lot of really just sort of fulfilling a need for people to feel that testing was happening. Look, my involvement was with a particular part of the Lloyds Banking Group business. I was based in Bristol at the time, and we had Lloyds had a big office there, and I was working as part of the commercial banking group there, and we had a very sort of focused responsibility on particular systems that affected certain customers. So we didn't get a lot of visibility of everything that was happening within that program. But there was just this sense that there were just hundreds, if not thousands, of people involved in this. It was absolutely huge. I believe it was the biggest integration program that's been run. I mean, certainly at the time, that's what people were saying. Whether that's still the case, I don't know. But it's certainly affected, many millions of customers. And so there was a big focus on obviously making sure that those customers were not adversely affected by what happened. But there was also cultural things to bring into the mix. When you're bringing two big organisations together, it's not just a matter of technology. It's all the people involved. There's inevitably going to be people's jobs are changing. People are going to lose jobs. There was a lot of implications of that programme in many different ways. And as a contractor working there, I was very mindful of all of those implications, not just the implications of the technology itself.
And I'm curious. So you're originally from the UK, but now you're based in sunny Sydney, Australia. How did you when and how did you make that change?
So I've been in Sydney for about 5 years now, and it really came about. I'd actually been for a short stint in Sydney about 14 years ago, and when I was here, I did some work for a company who were then called Access Testing, and I operated as a consultant for them for about 6 months. Now, when I finished my engagement with Lloyds that we just talked about, I did sort of consider some different paths at that stage. I'd been involved in financial services and banking for quite a long time, and I wanted to try some different things. You mentioned games earlier. I even considered, whether I could move into games testing and whether that was something where my experience could be valuable. But another thing I really wanted to try my hand at was consulting. So I'd had a very brief experience, but I felt that with the number of years I'd had in testing, I would like to try my hand at consulting in a bit more depth. So I contacted Access again, and through that, we came to an arrangement, and I moved the family over at the end of 2012. And I was really excited to be not only starting a life in a new country, but starting a new chapter in my career. And it turned out to be one of the best, probably the best career move I made. It was a great experience to work for a consulting organisation and a company that are very, very innovative and very willing to try new things. But also to work in a different country and to experience a different market. I often say to people here in Australia that I don't think they realise quite how pioneering they can be. It's a young country, and it's a place where people are willing to try new things. It's a cultural melting pot of Sydney. There's lots of different people from different countries coming together. But just in a business sense, people will try new things. They're not frightened to try new things. And that for me was very, very refreshing. And it's been a great experience. I don't work for Access anymore. I stayed with Access. They're now called Access HQ. The HQ stands for Human Quality, which gives you a little indication as to how the book came about as well. We talked about quality from a human perspective a great deal at that company, and a lot of our services were tailored to trying to provide quality for humans. And so it was a great experience for me. I have moved on, but I've taken those lessons and that philosophy on with me in my career.
Yeah, and I've got a bunch of questions to ask you about that. Before moving on, though, I wanted to ask you, what was spiders aside, what was the biggest adjustment that you found you had to make moving to Australia, or to Sydney specifically? Say it's a big country.
Yeah, it is. I mean, the culturally, it's not hugely dissimilar from the UK. There's a lot of common ground, and from that perspective, it wasn't that difficult to make the adjustment. I guess the biggest thing was just on a personal level. My family had 2 young children. My son was actually only 3 months old when we moved across. So it was pretty challenging from that perspective, and settling the family in, and just setting up home, and adjusting to the way of life was quite challenging. Interestingly, I suppose the fitting into the new job was probably one of the easier parts of it. I certainly found that people were exceptionally friendly and helpful in all ways in Australia, and that really made it a lot easier. I think it's a wonderful thing to do. I think if anybody has the opportunity to work in a different country, I think it's a great opportunity to take. I think you learn a lot about yourself, and you learn a lot about other people by operating in different countries.
Yeah, speaking of actually both, you just reminded me, both Australia and moving to different countries. I've interviewed a few testers for this podcast who've published books on Leanpub. Alan Richardson comes to mind, but also David Greenlees, who moved from Australia to New York City, if I remember correctly. And actually, I did have a question related to that, not just a memory popping up, but if there's something that sets you apart, or is there any particular kind of preoccupation you have with respect to testing that would be sort of more unique to you perhaps than to other people? Is there any particular hobby horse you would like to that you talk about when you're talking with other testers about testing?
Yeah, I think the people you've mentioned there would probably be quite consistent with this, but certainly the more context driven and the more exploratory methods of testing are something that I'm certainly aligned with. I guess I would never say that there's anything that's kind of unique about my philosophy, but I do think, going back to the start of our conversation, that focus on the human impact of technology is something that perhaps gets lost sometimes, and something that I really am a strong advocate of. I have a lot of interest in the world of usability and of customer experience. And also human-centered design. Those are sort of subjects that I've become very interested in, and I see a lot of parallels with what we do as testers. And I see that we can learn things from understanding those subjects. I think if you delved into conversations about testing over the last 10 years, you'd probably find that many of those conversations revolved around the subject of automation and revolved around the subject of testers developing their skills with coding and with automation. And look, I totally understand that, and it's something that I support, and I believe that it's important for people to develop those kind of skills. However, I also think it's equally important that we focus on the human aspects, and we keep in mind that what we're doing is we're providing software and technology that is intended to benefit people. And so I sort of emphasize this in my discussions around testing. And I mean, as I guess we'll move on to the book, but one of the things that I've introduced in there is this model of 3 dimensions of quality, and they're intended to be quality aspects that are considered from the point of view of a customer, from the person who's using the software. Most of the discussions that we have around quality tend to be quite technical as well. So I guess if I had to pick out one thing that maybe is slightly different in my philosophy, maybe that's it.
Great, that's a great answer. Thank you very much for that. Actually, we have just one more question before we move on to your book specifically, and that's a lot of people who work in, say, the startup or tech sector, like I do, we work on often, the entire company can be a small team, and without necessarily the resources to hire a dedicated tester or, a consultant or something like that. And so you end up, I like to use the word cowboy when I'm referring to kind of randomly just attacking things. I've done, working for Leanpub, I've done a lot of testing as a non-technical person and certainly not trained as a tester. And I've always approached it like just to be as creative as I can, try to understand everything that can be broken and then try to break it in as many ways as I can. But is there anything, if you were to give advice, say, to someone who's, let's say that, young, just starting out in a startup and they need to test a product, how would you, what's the sort of main advice you would give them for what to do? I mean, if that could be a book to read, it could be a couple of techniques.
Yeah. Look, I mean, there's certainly some fantastic material out there. I mean, one of the best things that people starting out in testing can do is to try and tap into the testing community that exists on Twitter, and the testing bloggers that are out there. There really are some fantastic people who are willing to share their experience and their knowledge. And I mean, this is a community that I probably only really tapped into over the last 3 or 4 years, but I've learned an incredible amount. It's been a real revelation to me to read people's stories and thoughts on things. So, that word learning is crucial. Testing and learning are absolutely linked. Not only the idea of learning new things about how you test, to improve your career, but as you are testing, you are learning. So I think it's crucial that testers have an interest in learning. If I had to pick out some specific recommendations for people, certainly I would say anything by Gerald Weinberg. But specifically the book Perfect Software and Other Illusions About Testing, which for me is the single best book about testing, and it really does challenge a lot of the perceptions that exist about testing and offer some really practical advice as well. And there's a whole lot of other people I could recommend. I could list off any number of names for you, but really if you tap into that testing community, that's a great place to start. I should probably actually mention the Ministry of Testing as well, who provide a huge number of resources and will introduce testers to lots of the key people that they should probably follow and pay attention to.
Moving on to another resource that I would personally definitely recommend, your book, Changing Times, which I was mentioning to you before the interview I really like in a number of ways. Before I go maybe myself into a little bit of detail about the book and how it's structured, I was wondering if you could just explain a little bit about what the book is about and who it's meant for.
Yeah, sure. Look, I recognise that really the primary audience for this book is probably going to be people who work in software development. However, I really didn't want to limit the audience to that group of people. I tried to write the book in a way that made it accessible to anybody. So anybody who has an interest in technology and how it affects our lives, I hope will get something from the book. But for people who do work in software development, I hope it sort of promotes the thinking about the human aspect of technology, and I hope it maybe presents a different perspective on some of the some of the trends and some of the things that are happening in software development now. So I'll cover, for example, lean and agile development. There's a passage in there about continuous deployment. There's various elements about some of the things that are going on in software development that I hope will maybe give people a different way of looking at things. So I did want to, target a wide group of people with the book. But I also wanted to maybe do something different in the way it's structured. And, as you said at the start, many of the books I read and the books that I really love are very focused on the sort of methods and maybe sort of the theory of what we do. I wanted to kind of marry up a fictional and a non-fictional element to it's almost like writing two books, I guess, and bringing them together to create something new.
Yeah, that's one of the things I really enjoyed about the book. In particular, the structure is you're sort of throughout the book, you're chapter by chapter telling the story of a kind of day in the life of a journalist, from when she wakes up to later in her day, so the chapter will describe this portion of this journalist's day, what they do, and the many different ways in which they interact with technology, and in a way, the way technology interacts with them. And I have to say, I was, right from the beginning, the lucidity and detail of the descriptions of this person's activity struck me, because I'd never seen anyone describe so accurately, like put a mirror up to my own existence in some ways. Like there's this great description of how she picks, the first thing she does is she hears the tone of her phone, because that's what she uses for her alarm, and then she opens it up, and inevitably she ends up sucked into social media, or thinking about getting sucked into social media, and like, are there going to be people attacking me, and like the routine of having to block or report people, things like that, and the way you tie that into the fact that as a female journalist, she might be subject to particular kinds of interactions on social media that not necessarily everybody else would. And it was just fascinating, not just because the structure of story about a person and then description of what their interaction with technology was one thing, but like holding up this mirror to our lives in a way that I've never read. People talk about it all the time, people do write about it all the time, but where the focus is on the details of that interaction that we're doing all day long, I thought was really brilliant. One idea in particular that seemed to come up a few times that I wanted to ask you about was temperature changes. So I think when, from my description, people were probably thinking, oh, it's all about, screens and stuff like that. But one thing that you describe, multiple times is the experience of going from, you wake up in an air-conditioned space, and then you walk out and you're in the heat, and the impact that has on you, or you go from the heat into an air-conditioned space. Was that deliberate that you brought that up repetitively? Was there something you were trying to get at there?
There wasn't anything, but it wasn't kind of an allegory for anything. I guess the point of that, and it was actually something you mentioned, David Greenlee's earlier. I read an article David wrote a few years back about usability and the effect of people's moods as they enter into usability testing sessions. And I think this is a really important point, that we often think about personas and we often think about emotional responses to technology, but we don't always think about how people are feeling as they enter into that relationship. So, as in the story, as Kim moves into these air-conditioned environments and out into the heat, it all plays a part in setting her mood, and it plays a part in how she feels. And that, in turn, affects then her interactions with technology. She feels more frustrated in situations where she's maybe a bit hot and flustered, or she's rushing for a bus or whatever it may be. And we sometimes lose sight of that. As humans, all of these things affect our lives, and they therefore affect our perception of the products that we use, of the technology that we use. It's a very, very complex relationship. And yeah, look, I really wanted to try and get that fact across, and the words you use are very kind, the things you said, and about holding a mirror up to our lives, and that was something I really wanted to try and do, and I wanted people to feel a bond with Kim, a kind of that they could relate to her because it was similar to her life, and certainly, some of the examples come from my own life, and I know I'm not unique in, picking up my phone as soon as I wake up in the morning and scrolling through social media. And I recognise that that's not a healthy thing to do. So I kind of talk about that in the book. But it's important that we recognise the social changes that are happening as a result of the technology that we use. It all plays a part in that complex relationship we have.
Speaking of mood and that concept relationship, you have a line, this is probably going to be a long question, I'll try to keep it as short as I can, but you have a line which gets to the heart of one of my own product design hobby horses, where you say, quote, "A product which is regularly enhanced will inevitably lose some of its familiarity," end quote. And one thing that's true of every, I'm going to put enhancement in scare quotes, is that it's a change. And whether the change is positive or negative, a change, the user in the first place relates to it as, oh, something's changed. And they have to adapt to every change that's made. So whether it's positive or not, the first experience is always, it's different now. And one of the sort of just only semi-tongue-in-cheek like sort of jokes I have is you often end up when you're interacting with products, you can like digital products, software products, you can feel like you're in a real life adventure game where you have to solve some arbitrary puzzle every time you try to do something in your environment. Like old games like King's Quest or something like that. It's like, how do you open the door? Well, solve this crazy arbitrary puzzle. My non-technical brother has an analogy with doorknobs, and he says, I say he's non-technical because he complains about how technical people sometimes enjoy the challenge and forget what it's like for just a normal person trying to use it as a piece of equipment. And he says, imagine every time you went back to your home, the way the doorknob worked had changed.
Yeah,
you'd start to be scared to try to open the door, and you'd be apprehensive even approaching it, even if you knew it would be a simple puzzle. But it's like, really, like, this is my house, and I've got to figure out something new. And one of the things I enjoyed about your book was the dry humor. And you have an example of this where you say, quote, "The website was apparently created with a secondary purpose as a kind of psychological test," end quote. And I wanted to ask you, from the perspective of people who are creating products and designers and things like that, they often feel that their job is to keep putting out new designs, because that's what they're there for, keep putting out new features, keep putting out new enhancements. And I was wondering if you have any advice to people like that, how they can avoid falling into that trap, because you often don't know, right? You don't know that people stop using your product because you made an improvement, or because you make improvements too often, and now they just relate to it as this thing that can't be depended on. And how can people avoid that?
Look, I think probably one of the most important things is just bearing in mind what you said at the start there, that familiarity with a product is important to some people. People don't necessarily want change. They may be comfortable with what they have. And I think one of the things I talk about is how the very nature of what a product has changed. We used to go and buy a car, and a car would have a list of features, and you would know that when you entered into that arrangement, when you bought that car, you would be buying it, and it probably last you 4 or 5 years. It wouldn't substantially change. You may change elements of it. You may change the tyres, but the car was still the car. Now with what's happening with motor vehicles, you get updates. Your product changes over time. You don't necessarily end up with the product that you started out with. Now, for some people, that's exciting. For other people, they're not so comfortable with it. So from a designer's point of view, and look, I'm not a designer, and I'd hesitate to offer too much advice to designers, but I'd certainly say, consider your customers and consider the many different factors that go into their relationship with the product. If they are familiar with something, if they are comfortable with something, they may not want it to change. And I kind of realized that as I was writing about continuous deployment in the book, I was kind of, swimming against the tide a little bit, and maybe, people who are advocates and evangelists for continuous deployment may not agree with what I was saying. But, the trend is very much for rapid, frequent delivery of change at the moment. And whilst I understand that, and I understand the competitive advantages, and I understand the benefits of being able to respond to customers quickly, those are well understood. But there's another side to this, which is maybe thinking about the impact on the customer, thinking about the person who is actually using the product and what it means for them. It doesn't always follow that frequent, rapid change is what a customer will want. And it's worth thinking about that depending on the context of the product and what your customers do with it.
Yeah, I was going to say, especially depending on the context of the product. For example, we spoke earlier about, you working on, banking processes. I believe you work for a large insurance company now. And you were reminding me, I was just paying royalties to our authors. Today we pay at the beginning of every month. We've paid out millions of dollars to Leanpub authors, and of course I use a payment service which I won't name because I love them in many ways. But they've started in their design. They've started doing things that might be totally appropriate in another type of company where continuous deployment and things like delight and things like that might be what's most important to people for keeping them using it. But what they've started doing is these crazy spinners and light boxes and things to interact with. And in particular, when you go to pay, they randomly show you a set of circle faces and account names, which is supposed to make you pleased or something. But the thing is that, from the perspective of someone making payments, I don't care what the circle face is. I certainly don't want to be showed anything random. And I don't want to be shown an account name either, because what I'm doing is I'm sending money to an email address.
You just want to make a payment.
And you just want to make the payment. But I guess it's like anybody can upload any image they want to their account, and anybody can enter any name they want, like first name, last name, into their account. I cannot know who that is for sure if I'm only seeing that information. Now, if I'm on social media or something like that, if I'm on Facebook, well, that's not, if you make a mistake or someone messes with you a little bit, maybe it's not the biggest thing in the world. But if you're over time sending out millions of dollars in payments, I guess what I'm trying to say is nobody who'd ever had the responsibility of doing that, and nobody who ever feared sending $50 to the wrong person because then they don't have another $50 and grandma can't come visit for Christmas because she can't get a bus ticket now. Nobody who ever approached things from that perspective would ever have designed a payment system the way this one has been designed. And I was wondering what you think people who say are sitting on top of a product can do to help their designers be more empathetic with respect to, the needs of the specific needs of the product that they have, rather than what the latest design fad or convention might be for impressing your fellow designers.
Yeah, look, I mean, the example you gave is a great one, and one of my colleagues at the company where I now work, which is, as you say, a big insurance company. I've heard them saying, that people don't want to be entertained when they're signing up for an insurance policy. They just want to get it done. It's a different kind of product. It's depending on the context. Having something which is enjoyable to use may be very important, but it's not always important. Sometimes it just has to be useful. It just has to be able to do the thing that it's intended to do. And I mean, in terms of understanding what matters to the people who are going to use the product, the simplest thing is to talk to people, to spend time with them, to try and understand the way they use it. One of the great things that I've seen at this place where I'm now working is that developers and technical people will actually go and sit with colleagues who operate in customer contact centers. They'll actually sit with them and see how they use the applications which they work on. They'll look at the practical things they do to get to work around some of the problems that occur. And then developers can take that back and can adjust the way they work, and it really makes a difference to that kind of relationship between the developer and, in this sense, the colleague or the customer who is using the product. Having that sort of deep understanding of the way people actually use things is crucial. And it's not easy. I mean, people, empathy is a word that is used a lot in product development. And I, obviously got a whole section of the book about empathy. It's something that I think is absolutely crucial. But it's not easy. You can't just switch it on. You have to really spend time with people and understand the way people do things to develop that empathy for them. And only then can you kind of apply that thinking to the work that you do in developing technology.
One of the things you write about most about in your book, I suppose, is the stuff that we know we're interacting with. But you also write some of the technology which affects us is visible to us, yet more is hidden from view. And you talk about how this hidden technology is used to influence us, and this is sort of where things get things about like empathy and things like that get really subtle. I mean, if let's say you're making a product or testing a product that the person might not even know is there in their life. I guess I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what sort of technology you're getting at when you talk about what's hidden from our day-to-day, ordinary, like sort of literal view of things.
Yeah, I mean, specific there. I guess I was referring to the way that the data that we provide, whether we know it or not, the way that data is used. And I mean, there's an example I give in the book of retargeting in advertising. When you go onto a website and you buy a television, and then for the next month you see adverts for televisions. Which seems a little strange because you've already purchased a television, so why do you need another one? But it was really about we're very aware of the technology that is presented in front of us, the devices that we use, the websites that we use, but there's a whole lot that sits behind that, the data that underpins it. That it's important that people are aware of that, and they're aware of the fact that they are providing companies with something when they use a product. I think when I describe the concept of a customer, I talk about even if a financial transaction hasn't taken place, you are a customer. If you use Google or any of the other major websites, you are a customer because you are giving them something. You're giving them data, and you're giving them your time, you're giving them traffic. These are all things that are valuable to them. They can make money from this. So you are a customer. And it's kind of important that people are mindful of that, because technology is so intertwined with our lives now. Understanding the extent to which that occurs is probably an important thing for us all to understand.
Yeah, I guess it's maybe a slight digression, but we can maybe take a couple of minutes. I'd like to ask you, what is your opinion about that broadly? I mean, I know one often hears, maybe from, the EU or something like that, about how, people potentially, like organizations potentially, or governmental organizations potentially creating regulation that means users whose data is being used in these ways you're describing should be compensated somehow. Just if we could take a couple minutes, what's your opinion about that? Is it enough? Would it be enough if the companies simply were more explicit with you about what they're doing and what they're using it for? Do you think that there should in the future be some kind of compensation for the user? I mean, if Google is watching everything I do and then selling that information on to advertisers, essentially, should I get paid?
Yeah, look, I think probably more than the financial aspect of it, I think it's more a question of control. And I think increasingly people will want to have some measure of control over what data is taken from them, what information is taken from them, and how it is used. Now, that's not going to be an easy thing to overcome. People don't necessarily want to spend time reading through terms and conditions and, familiarising themselves with how things are used. But I think there's probably a balance that needs to be addressed in terms of who owns that information. I, as an individual, would like to feel that I have control over how much information I provide and how companies use it. How we do that, I don't know. But I think that's probably the more important discussion than whether people should necessarily be, financially rewarded for that data. Some people may want to be. Some people may be very happy to pass over large amounts of information, and they may want some financial return for it. Other people may say, quite the opposite view, that they'd much rather keep control of that information themselves. I do think it's a question that not just governments, but the big tech companies need to ask. How do they manage that relationship with their customers in a meaningful and fair way that allows customers to control things?
Yeah, it's a really fascinating topic. I mean, it is really interesting. I mean, as you point out multiple times in your book, and this has sort of deep meanings for how one creates and designs products. But everybody's different. Everybody's different, even individually over time, as you say, as their mood change and as they changes and as they change. But one interesting thing I've encountered around data is just I'll say this briefly, but Leanpub sells books, and we deal with authors all the time and readers. And one of the debates is, Amazon versus the indie bookstores. And I won't go into specifics, but there was this collection of bookstore owners and advocates in a city in the United States who, Amazon was going to be opening a warehouse or something like that. And they issued a press release where they said, Amazon is just gathering all your information. It's just gathering all your information. Do you really want that? What you really need is us to personally know you and know everything about you and enough about you that we know better than you what you need to read next. And they talked about both an algorithm and meaning algorithm, a logarithm, which I thought was hilarious. But, they said Amazon may have the logarithm or something like that, but we've got the personal touch. And it was just really curious, when people are dealing, there's a certain type of person who gets mad at, what is it like? The French have some acronym for like Google, Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft, and oh no, that's terrible. That basically data about me exists on these computers out there and is being collected by computers, but the local guy actually knowing everything about me, I'm totally fine. I'm totally fine with that. There's nothing sinister going on there. And I guess I just bring up this example partly because it's funny, but partly because it goes to show that, when you're creating technology and when you're interacting with people, it's not just that they will differ from each other. It's that like they may even hold internally contradictory positions, and that the challenges of addressing this when you're making a product that's meant for wide consumption are vast and not necessarily reconcilable.
That's a really important point. And I guess I only kind of touched on it really around trade-offs, and the fact that to make something more usable, you may need to compromise on security, for example. To make something more personalized, you may have to take more data from people. There are trade-offs here, and it is, there's a responsibility on each of us as individuals as well to think about what we really want. It's not necessarily a case of just blaming the companies and saying that they're taking things from us. We have a kind of responsibility to ourselves as well, and we have to be realistic about what the technology can and cannot do. There are trade-offs, and there are trade-offs that the companies have to manage, and there are trade-offs that we have to be mindful of as individuals as well.
Speaking of being mindful, that reminds me of a distinction you draw in your book between this concept of build quality in and what I think you advocate, which is think quality in. And I'm guessing you're being a little bit provocative, perhaps, with that distinction. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it was a little bit provocative. I mean, I hear the term build quality in a lot. I mean, there's a couple of problems that I have with that term. The first is that, it kind of implies that quality is a sort of ingredient. It's a tangible thing that can be kind of stirred into the pot and mixed in. And suddenly, if you add quality in at the right time, you're going to have a quality product. And we know it just doesn't work like that. And it's a kind of a strange way to look at things. And the other thing is the word build. Rightly or wrongly, I think people tend to associate that with developers, with people writing the code, and it's almost like the burden for quality. It's like an attempt to shift it from testing, which is obviously not the right place to think about quality, to people who are writing the code. And what I'm saying is that that's not enough. We have to think about quality at every stage. Anybody who is involved in the idea behind the product, the design of the product, the way it is built, the way it's implemented, the way it's supported, the way it's maintained. Quality is something that is a responsibility of all of us. And I know that when people first talked about build quality, and that's really the point they were trying to get across, is that it is everybody's responsibility. And I completely support that. I just think that the term itself, build quality, here has maybe been slightly misinterpreted. I guess I'm just putting my own spin on it, saying that we need to think about it at every stage.
Yeah, one of the great points you made when talking about thinking about quality in your book was about the fact that people often have especially perhaps people of a certain type or at a certain type of organization, have a tendency to try to quantify quality. You have this great pun, which may not be original to you, but I don't know if I've come across it before, where people take refuge in numbers, where you mean not like in groups of people, which is the way it's meant, but in actual numbers. You have this great joke too. I think it's something like, imagine you're at a construction site and the, foreman says, bring me some cement. Oh, and by the way, bring me a bag of quality as well, please. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. I mean, why can't you quantify quality?
Yeah, I think this is a very, very big subject, and it's something that comes up for discussion a lot amongst the testing community, because quite often we will be asked to do exactly that as testers, and I will hold my hand up and say I've tried to do it. I've over the years I've produced horrible graphs and charts and Excel spreadsheets with numbers in them that at the time I thought were good ways of measuring quality. And I guess what I've come to realize is that you cannot put a simple numeric measure on quality, and there isn't a single unit you can apply that will tell you whether quality exists in your product or in the relationship between the product and person. Because it is so subjective, there's a number of different things you need to think about. And I'm not discounting metrics completely. I'm not saying that we should ignore them, because I do think that there are patterns that metrics can sometimes display that give us a clue to where there might be problems. But to me, they tend to be more related to problems with the process rather than the quality of something. I hesitate to use the word defects. I don't really like the word a lot, but when we have large numbers of defects emerging during development, it may be something to do with the way that people are being asked to work. It may be people being put under pressure. It may be a sign that communication isn't working well, and that there's misinterpretation of what the product is supposed to do. It doesn't necessarily tell us anything about quality, because what might be a defect to one person may not be to somebody else. It is very subjective. So I think it's important that the kind of the emotional response to products is we pay attention to that as much as we do to numbers about things like how many test cases have been run and how many defects have been raised. Those things don't necessarily tell us whether we have what we wanted or whether our customers will get what they wanted.
Yeah, it's as you say. Thanks for that great answer. It's as you say. It's a really big topic and very broad in its what it touches on. But one of the things I've noticed is that often, to kind of invert the normal charge that goes along with it, often people who demand the data and demand the numbers are actually being very lazy intellectually. And the reason they get away with it is because the numbers is usually associated with a kind of macho, hard-ass, objective approach to things. And then when someone comes along and says, no, it's actually subjective, they'll represent that person as being insufficiently rigorous or something like that. But what you end up with then, because there's this top-down and just kind of cultural kind of macho pressure to have numbers, you end up people with engaging in just nonsense magical thinking, like the publishing industry will grow by 3.25% in the next 5 years. Nonsense. That's just bullshit. You can't predict who's going to win, the Super Bowl next year, but you could tell me that an entire global industry is going to grow by like to 2 percentage points at the end of 3 years from now. But somehow the introduction of numbers into certain types of practices brings with it this aura of an objectivity and a predictability that doesn't really exist, but people find comforting, and especially people who might be, say, higher up than you, who have to report to someone higher up to them. If they just go, oh, well, it's all kind of, getting a sense of things, they'll be like, well, that's not a good basis for, even if that were true, that's not a good basis for discussion. Give me some numbers.
Yeah, it's easy to distill numbers. It's easy for managers to extract what they want from numbers and to distill them into another message, which then goes to another layer of people, and so on and so on. As you do that, you move further and further away from the reality. The best kind of reporting on testing is when people talk about it, when they have conversations about what they've observed, and what this has told them about the product, and what this may mean for customers who are going to use the product, and what could be done to address it. They're conversations, they're stories, but those kind of things are not easy to summarize and to pass up a reporting chain, which is why people do, there is safety in numbers, because it's something that everybody understands. It's black and white. It's tangible. And it's a very, very hard conversation. And I know a lot of testers struggle with this about, when you have that kind of macho environment where managers are pushing for numbers, it's not easy to say no. It's not easy to push back and say, look, those numbers don't actually give you what you want to know. Let me talk to you about it. And it's something of a skill which I guess testers probably need to develop over time, and they need to build up good relationships with the people who are asking for numbers. They need to understand why those people want those numbers, and they then need to think about, well, what can I give them instead that will maybe give them something more meaningful. It's possibly a slightly underrated and maybe not thought about enough as part of the testing role. How do we give information that is meaningful and useful to people?
You talk, and my last question about the subject of your book is that, and you mentioned this earlier, you talk about 3 dimensions that affect our perception of quality, that, if you are talking perhaps in a non-quantitative way about, a product, you can reference whether it is desirable, or its desirability, its dependability, and its durability. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about those 3 dimensions and what you sort of mean by each of them. So let's start with what's desirability.
Yeah, so I really talk about a product being desirable from the point of view of how that person feels when they're using it. This comes back to one of the main things in the book is this subject of a relationship between a person and a product, which is something that I actually read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance quite recently, and it's something that relationship is discussed there. It's something that I put a quote in the book from Michael Bolton, which he talked about in a blog post, and I guess those 3 dimensions play into that idea of a relationship. We know what is desirable to us in a relationship with a person. I don't necessarily use the word desirable to mean attractive. That's part of it, but it's really about what we want, what we need from that relationship. So there's a number of different factors that are covered in there. I won't go into all the different quality aspects that are within each of the dimensions, but I've tried to pull together a number of human-focused words that relate to each of the dimensions. And with desirable, it's the factors which make products something that we want to use, something we want to own, something we want to have. And then moving on to the others. So dependability is really about, if something's dependable, it's all about the trust that we have between ourselves and the product. So, the factors that make us trust something, something we can rely on. Again, a number of different things that play into that, but it's a very important part of a relationship that we have trust. And then finally, the last one is durable, and durable is about how enduring something is. I know that durable can also mean sort of robustness, how tough something is. And again, that could be part of it for a particular product. It may need to be robust, but really, I'm using the word durable to describe how long-lasting a relationship is. And I give an example in the book of Kim has a digital voice recorder that she uses as a journalist, and it's something she's comfortable with. She doesn't feel the need to replace it, even though some of her colleagues kind of tease her about it. They've all got more modern devices than she has. She doesn't care because she's happy with what she's got, and therefore she has a long-lasting relationship with that particular product. So, yeah, I mean, obviously there's a bit of a play going on with the fact that it's 3Ds and it's 3 dimensions. But I think that those three factors, which I'm not by any way saying that they should be treated as a sort of standard, and if you have these three things, you have quality. I'm just encouraging people to think about those 3 dimensions as different ways to consider quality from a human perspective.
Speaking on the subject of products and quality, your book itself is a product, and one I would say of high quality. And one thing I noticed was that you used Leanpub's Bring Your Own Book feature to publish it to our bookstore. This lets authors create their own ebook files with any tools they like rather than Leanpub's workflow, and then upload them for sale on our store. And I was just wondering what tools you use to create your book for anyone out there who's interested in self-publishing.
Yeah, look, I mean, I was very fortunate. Again, with the publishing, my sister actually runs a publishing house in the UK called Head Publishing, and she does some proofreading and copywriting, proofreading and editing services as well. I really drew on her knowledge, and she's actually written 3 books herself, 3 novels. She gave me some good pointers, about writing a book. The process itself for me was it was slightly strange. I mean, I was just kind of snatching time to write when I could. Working full time and having a young family, it's kind of difficult to find time to write. So I actually was writing on my iPad a lot of the time. I had Microsoft Office on my iPad. I was writing on the bus going to work. Then in the evenings, when I had some time in the evenings, I would write as well. Weekends were a good time to do some writing. But I really had to just be able to kind of switch it on and off. And so it was really important that I had a sort of map of what the structure of the book would be. So I used Mind Map to kind of, build up the structure of how I wanted the book to work. When I'd kind of got most of the words down, which was really many months before the book was published, it then went into what I found with the most frustrating and difficult period, which was reviewing and reworking it. I did find that incredibly difficult. I was very lucky to have some fantastic reviewers from the testing community who I'd come across on Twitter who gave me some fantastic feedback, and I was very, very grateful to them. But just the process of waiting for comments to come back and finding that sometimes the comments contradicted each other and sometimes I didn't agree with them. I found it really difficult, and I found that I got sucked into this kind of world of, I was sort of analysing individual words in the book, and, was that exactly the word I meant, and did I want to change the wording slightly? And you can get really bogged down in that. You could get to a point where, you never release the book because you're so intent on getting it perfect. And obviously, it's never going to be perfect. You have to accept, you have to compromise, you have to, make little changes that perhaps you wouldn't have done from the first place. But that, once that was done, I then passed it across to my sister, who did the sort of formal editing of the book, did a fantastic job on it for me. I also had, you'll have seen the illustrations in the book. One of the things I really love about the book is the illustrations, which were done by a lady called Catherine Clark. And Catherine, I gave her an idea of what was happening in the chapters of the book, and Catherine pulled together the illustrations. So there was a lot of to and fro between myself and Catherine on what the illustration should look like.
How did you find your illustrator?
Oh, so Catherine's a friend of my sister. So she's done a lot of the illustration and covers for the books which Head Publishing produce. And I was really delighted with those illustrations. They're absolutely fantastic. They really kind of bring the characters to life. And I really wanted that. I had in mind a book I used to read when I was a kid was Three Men in a Boat by Jerome K. Jerome, which was written at the early sort of, I think it was 1890s that book was written, but each of the chapters has a little black and white illustration at the start. And I wanted something similar. And I think that Catherine did a great job in putting those together. But as the sort of the form of the book took shape, it did become quite a laborious process. And you get to a stage as a writer where all you want to do is publish the book. You've done what you feel is the hard bit, which is writing the words, and you just want to get the book out there. So it can be quite painful, waiting for those final steps to occur.
Yeah, thanks for explaining that process and explaining it so well. One thing. In a way, I'm kind of not surprised to hear that you went through agony because, and I guess this is kudos to you and to your sister and all your people who give you feedback, but I found one typo in the book. And it was like, it was almost like as I turned page after page after page, I was like, how was this done? Because, it's hard. It's hard to write a book and publish a book, no matter how many people are involved, and no matter how, professional the copy editors are and how big name the publisher is, to achieve what you guys have achieved is pretty remarkable in my experience. So, I want to say that even though you may have gone through some agony, I mean, from a reader's perspective, we're all grateful.
That's very kind. Look, it's. I kind of, I feel like even though you're saying there's only one typo, like now I've got that feeling of disappointment. Oh no, a typo is sort of. It gives a sense of. It's interesting because, of course, the part of the subject of the book is about product development, and it does give that sense of what it's like to release a product and wanting to get it right and wanting to provide something which, in this case, readers will enjoy. It's really tough, and you do have to get the balance between perfection and trying to perfect something and something that's good enough. I don't like that term "good enough." I like to try and get things exactly how I want them, but you can't always do it. And it really does take a team of people to work on a book. Everybody says this. I know every author says this in their notes at the start, but it's not just down to the author. There are so many people involved in producing a book, and so many people that you feel grateful to, and that you want to thank and you want to acknowledge for everything they've done in helping you to think about the subject and to go through the process of writing the book.
Yeah, definitely. And it's one of the fun things about this job is seeing the different approaches that so many authors take. A sort of canonical Leanpub author, everybody has to fight that battle. When am I ready to release? And with Leanpub, because books can be published in progress, you perhaps see people have a wider spectrum of choices that they can make than in sort of more conventional forms of publishing. But the one key factor that unites them all is, it takes a lot of people to make a really good book, usually. And one of the great things about getting a team together is that although you as the creator of it, and I very much sympathize with this, oh no, a typo, the person who found it, though, they feel good because they helped you out. And that can be someone you're paying as a copy editor, that can be, a colleague that's reading your book, or it can even be a customer who emails you or something like that and says, hey, I found this on this page, can you fix that? But, one of the universal experiences or nearly universal things is, it takes a lot of people to really make something perfect in the end.
Yeah. Yeah.
One question I always like to ask people as I wrap up an interview is if there's anything about Leanpub that we could build for you that you can think of, what would that be? Or if there was anything we could fix for you, what would you like us to fix?
Look, I was thinking about Leanpub before we started talking, and one of the subjects that does come up in the book is that a product is much more than the code and the technology that people use. A big part of it is the support around the technology. You can use a terrible product, but if the support that is around it can kind of retrieve the situation, you come away with a kind of warm feeling. And one thing I must say about Leanpub is the support has been fantastic. I mean, I've actually been really, really impressed and really blown away by how quickly you have responded to questions that I've posed. So there's been a few things where I've emailed questions through, and you respond so quickly and so thoroughly, and with so much care. That's a fantastic thing, and that goes above and beyond the platform, which is excellent as well. So I've really found the whole sort of process of understanding sales and how things work really, really simple on the platform. And obviously, I didn't get to experience the process of actually writing the book through Leanpub. But as somebody who's effectively published through it and is selling the book through Leanpub, it is a wonderful experience. I can't think of anything that I would say would be kind of a major improvement on it. It has been great.
Oh well, thanks very much for all of that. I will cheerfully, on behalf of the team, accept the compliment and the feedback. We really appreciate that. It's been a lot of years of interacting with authors and readers to get it to the point where people can say things like that about it, and so we always really appreciate hearing that from authors. Well, thanks very much, Rich, for taking the time on your Saturday morning to talk to me. It's Friday evening where I am and Saturday morning where you are. I had a really great time. And I wanted to thank you very much for being on the Front Matter podcast and for being a Leanpub author.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.